that was that I began to think that it wasn't so much what brainwave pattern are you in, or what experience are you having, or what mental ability is being improved, although all of those things do happen. It was more that this technology, this type of technology, and also traditional meditation too, although to a lesser degree, is giving the brain a stimulus of a very precise nature that it cannot handle the way it's currently structured.
Right.
And then in order to handle that stimulus, the brain has to reorganize itself in a new way that can handle it. And it does that on a neurophysiological level by creating new neural connections in the brain and so on. And interestingly enough, that the more of these connections there are, and a lot of these are between the left and the right hemisphere, making more of a connection between the two sides of the brain, the more people have the experience of seeing how everything is connected. And the old way that they were seeing it, where things are seen as, isolated bits that are somehow interacting with each other and in opposition to each other in many cases, it's more and more difficult to see that. So you begin to see things in a more holistic way. At any rate, that sent me off in a different direction, because I was looking at this in terms of an evolutionary possibility rather than just a cause and effect thing that would put you into a certain state or cause you to, have more creativity or clearer thinking.
Now, do you think people can have the experience of interconnectivity without having that growth in neurons? And doesn't the growth in neurons take time? And aren't there some kinds of peak experiences where people can immediately have an experience of interconnectivity without growing tissue?
Well, I would be willing to bet, and I think there's some information actually in Megabrain about this, that when somebody has a peak experience, at the same time that's happening, these new connections are happening, that the two are really the same thing. I'm not so sure that it's true that it takes a lot of time to create them. It's kind of like the connections are really already there. All those neurons are already there. They're just not firing in certain patterns.
Yeah. We can certainly indeed come back and discuss that. One possible explanation is that, at least if we look in the interior in terms of phenomenology, what we call the upper left quadrant, there's a difference between states of consciousness and stages of consciousness. And certain kinds of states are immediately, almost in their entirety, available to people. For example, waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. People can have a dream state experience and a deep sleep state experiences pretty much with whatever neuronal capacity they have, if they're more or less mature adult human being. And they don't have to grow tissue to do that. But stages of psychological development take a lot of time. They really do have to grow, and you have to lay down structure for that to happen. It's not dissimilar. A stage of development is not dissimilar to, let's say, learn how to play a piano. You can have a peak experience, making love and feel one with nature temporarily, but you can't have a peak experience of being a concert pianist. In other words, that's going to take years if you're actually going to lay down that kind of structure. And it might be similar in the brain, in the upper right quadrant. In other words, it might be possible that certain brain states, you can actually get somebody into a theta state, and they will, rather immediately, within 30 minutes or so, have an experience of that kind of dreamy, subtle kind of state. Or have a theta alpha combination and maybe even experience temporary oneness and so on. But in order for that to be a rather permanent acquisition, maybe it's like stages in the upper left. You actually have to grow tissue, grow structure in the brain. And possibly that's what you're seeing in terms of a more enduring, long-lasting acquisition or understanding of interconnectivity. That's possible.
I agree with you. I think that, if certain parts of the brain fire in a certain way, which certainly can be partially induced from the outside,
right,
as with holosync, but certainly, with more traditional techniques, and even with some sort of environmental stimulus that's a normal stimulus, an event that happens in your life or whatever.
Right.
It can throw people into a certain state. In order to then, one way to describe this difference between states and stages would be to say that once you're at a certain stage, that state is really available to you, and it's available to you pretty much on an intentional basis,
I agree,
on a voluntary basis. That the structure in the brain is there so that, I find now that pretty much all I need to do to go into a certain state is intend to do it.
That's right.
And it's kind of like, if you ask me, how do I lift my arm, I couldn't tell you how I do it.
Right.
I just know how to do it.
Right.
But there's, hundreds and hundreds of muscles that have to work in a certain combination and all that, and if I tried to think my way through it with my conscious mind, I could never do it.
And people forget that you actually had to learn how to raise your arm intentionally. In other words, it took a year or two when you were first born to learn how to gain that kind of intentionality. And once the structure's laid down, then just by intending, it's there.
That's true. And that's one of the things that we see a lot with people. At first, the idea that someone could be in conscious control of their moods and emotions, and certainly states in a more metaphysical sense too, it just seems ridiculous to them.
Yeah.
Because they haven't had that experience. Their experience is that these things happen to you, not that you can intentionally do them. But it would be, like you were saying, a baby, if it could communicate with us, might find the idea that it was going to be able to, create intricate patterns on a piano keyboard at some point, kind of unlikely.
Exactly.
Because they have no experience of it.
Right.
Our program has 12 custom-made levels after the introductory level. And there's 4 levels called Awakening levels 1 through 4, 4 levels called Purification, and 4 levels called Flowering. Almost universally in Purification 1 or 2, people start saying, you know what, everything is fine. Everything is okay. They came to us saying there's a problem. Life is a problem, and I'm hoping that this thing you have is going to solve the problem. When they get about to Purification 1 or 2, they start saying, there's no problem. And the same stuff is happening in the world that was happening that they didn't like before, but they realized that there was no problem.
Yeah, I think that is very telling, and there's wonderful research, and I'd love to see much more of this kind of research done, particularly when we get more sophisticated brain-mind technology like holosync and others are developing, and that's the following. Some of this indeed was first done by the TM people. Skip Alexander, for example, who recently died, unfortunately, tragically with cancer. He was a young, brilliant researcher and did an enormous amount to pioneer the study of psychological developmental stages and how they were affected by meditation, in this case transcendental meditation.